Good afternoon. I'm Mary Jordan. I'm the editor of Washington Post Live. It's the arm of the media company that puts on, organizes presidential debates and other forums of newsworthy topics. So we're delighted to join the Center for Global Development today, and this is certainly a newsworthy topic. I ran the Washington Post bureaus in Tokyo, Mexico, and London for 14 years and worked abroad in 40 countries. So I'm certainly particularly aware of the importance and significance of the World Bank and its role globally. We are streaming now live on WashingtonPostLive.com, as well as the website for the Center for Global Development. And I want to welcome, a big welcome to our online audience. Lots of people are already tweeting out there. They're sending in questions, and we'll be doing that throughout our session today. I'm delighted now to introduce to you Nancy Birdsall. She is the Center for Global Development's founding president. She worked for the World Bank for 14 years in a number of roles, including director of the Policy Research Department. And there, she was responsible for the bank's economic research and policy analysis in trade, adjustment and growth issues, poverty and human resources, tax and expenditure, financial sector, environment, public sector, you name it, Nancy was in the middle of it. She's also served as the executive vice president for the Inter-American Development Bank. And there she oversaw a $30 billion, with a B, public and private loan portfolio. She's had so many roles it's hard to believe. From 1998 to 2001, she also served as the senior associate and director of the Economic Reform Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She's the author, the co-author, or the editor of more than a dozen books and over 100 articles in scholarly journals. She received her PhD from Yale and her MA from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So I'm going to turn you over now to a woman who knows just a little bit about global development. Nancy.
I didn't know I could go up on that side. Thank you very much, Mary Jordan, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Washington Post and Washington Post Live for partnering with us in organizing this series of events. As part of our collaboration, I'm pleased to be joined today by Howard Schneider, a staff writer at the Washington Post, who covers international economics and has been tracking closely the unprecedented competition for the presidency of the World Bank. After we hear from Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Howard will kick off a discussion by interviewing her and will then take questions from the audience, including a global audience, as Mary mentioned, that is watching the live webcast, who will be sending questions by email and Twitter. I'd also like to welcome now our audience here, as well as online. I must say it's great. You include many of the thought leaders in global development, ambassadors, heads of think tanks and NGOs, members of the business community and the media, leading academics and senior officials from the World Bank, the IMF, and other multilateral organizations, and a special welcome to those members of our board that are here. It's always a pleasure to see you. If the president of the World Bank is the leader of the international development community, then the people assembled here today and watching online around the world are, in a real sense, the representatives of that community. Before I welcome and introduce our speaker, I'd like to make 3 quick points. First, it matters who leads the World Bank. The bank is the world's preeminent development institution. For all its faults, it is nonetheless without peer as a global institution dedicated to economic development and poverty reduction. We see this each time the world's most powerful leaders, whether in the G8 or the G20, gather to seek ways to address shared problems. More often than not, the pledges that they make for collective action to increase economic growth and reduce poverty around the world wind up with the World Bank as the institutional home and focus for actual implementation, for getting it done. Of course, the president reports to the board, which in turn represents the nations of the world. Yet, he or she potentially has immense influence to lead and cajole the members into empowering the bank as an institution to take actions that are in their own best long-term shared interest. Second point, it matters how the World Bank president is chosen. My colleagues and I at the Center for Global Development have been among many in the international community, many of whom I see here, urging an open and competitive selection process without regard to nationality. A 2000 survey we conducted during the previous round of leadership selection found a broad international consensus, including among the American respondents, in support of such a view. An open and competitive process is necessary to ensure that the very best candidate is chosen and to ensure that he and or she has the broad support and legitimacy necessary to lead. Third point, the current competition is unprecedented. We have for the first time 3 officially nominated candidates, all of whom will be interviewed by the bank's executive board. Today's event is a part of that process. Regardless of the outcome, it's hard to imagine that we will ever return to the situation that prevailed just 5 short years ago when Robert Zoellick was nominated by the US president and the board's choice was only to vote yes or no. It now gives me great pleasure, finally, to introduce to you today's speaker. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala is a globally renowned Nigerian economist, best known for her current role as Finance Minister of Nigeria, actually more than Finance Minister, a kind of economic czarina in Nigeria, and for her work, of course, at the World Bank, including several years as one of its managing directors. A graduate of Harvard in economics with a PhD from MIT, she rose through the meritocratic World Bank bureaucracy in the years when doing so as a woman and an African meant you had to be a star. She garnered international recognition as Nigeria's Minister of Finance in 2003 to 2006, when she championed tough economic reforms, insisted on fiscal transparency to combat corruption, negotiated for Nigeria a $37 billion debt relief package, and oversaw Nigeria's first ever sovereign credit rating. Returning to the World Bank in 2006, at the request of Robert Zoellick, she served as a virtual second-in-command to him. In the spirit of full disclosure, I should say I have known Ngozi for at least 2 decades from her days at the World Bank, and I should say that she has been, I'm proud to say that she serves as one of several dozen people on our very distinguished board of directors at the center. And I also want to note that it was her name, it was one of 2 that Arvind Subramanian and I put forward in a February blog post as highly qualified potential candidates from the developing world who belonged on the short list of those to be considered as the next president of the World Bank. Please join me in welcoming Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala.
Thank you very much, Nancy. I want to thank the Washington Post and the CGD for holding this unusual event. I must declare that I remain forever proud of the Center for Global Development for always being at the edge of finding new ways of doing things, and this is one of them. Now, you bear with me because I've just had a marathon interview for 3.5 hours or so with the board of the bank. So I'm a little bit tired. So I'm sure you'll understand, but I'll try to do my best. I think what I'd like to do is to share with you. I think what most people want to hear is what is the vision for the World Bank and what would you do differently? After all, you've been a managing director within the bank. What is it that you would bring? So I want to talk on those topics and then perhaps leave the rest to questions. Let me start out by saying that my vision for the World Bank is very much informed by who I am and by what I've gone through in my life. And I'd like to share that with you to provide a context for why this vision. Why do I think the bank should be doing what it's doing? I grew up in a village in Nigeria with my grandmother when my parents were both abroad, studying in Germany for the first 9.5 years of my life. I know what it meant to go to the stream to fetch water, what it means to go to the farm with my grandmother to farm agricultural products, what it means when people are poor and they cannot get enough to eat. I lived it. It's not an observation. This is what I lived. I lived through the Civil War, the Nigeria-Biafra War, that raged from 1967 to 1970, where eating 1 meal a day was a luxury, where I saw children dying around me from kwashiorkor, where my parents lost everything that they owned, where they were in their mid-40s and had to start again. I know what it means not to have a place to sleep because you're running from the enemy, to sleep in the bush, to sleep on a table, anywhere you can. Why am I telling you all this? Because it's not good enough to say you know about poverty. You have to live it to know what it means, and I did. I lived a country that was in conflict, so I know what it means when violence and ethnic divisions and difficulties, turn development back on its head, and your country loses many years of productive endeavor. So I also know about post-conflict and what to do and how you deal with that. The rest of my life, my career, I've spent much beyond Africa. I've worked during my time at the World Bank in almost every region of this world, from East Asia, where I was a young economist working, to the Middle East, where I did my first managerial job, the first woman to hold a managerial position in the Middle East in the World Bank, to when I came back to the Middle East to work as the Director of Operations, which is the equivalent to a Deputy Vice President, to South Asia, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, all parts of the world, I've worked on issues. So my experience deals with issues that confront emerging market countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries, across the spectrum, and even developed countries. I've dealt with all of this. And this is what I think gives me the foundation to be able to confront the very complex problems that the World Bank faces today in a world of uncertainty, in a world that is forever changing, in a world where the World Bank itself did a study and found we had 180 incidents per year of different kinds that create uncertainty within the global environment. And now, in this year and age, it's about 360. It means every year you wake up, you don't know what sort of incident is going to confront you, from what part of the globe, and how you'll deal with it. And that's why you need an institution nimble and capable and able to do that. So my vision for the World Bank builds on all these experiences. It builds on the need to be responsive, to be nimble, to be creative, to be able to deliver for the hundreds and millions of poor people around the world. Not in terms of theory, not in terms of coming at it, because you're wanting to assist only, but in terms of actually living it. I want to add that my 4 years as Finance Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister and Coordinating Minister have given me a vantage point across the other side of the table, an experience about what the clients of the World Bank want from the bank. What is it that is the strength of this institution? And it does have many. And what are the weaknesses which we have to deal with? It's based on all this totality of experience and life that my vision for the World Bank is based. And I want to start out by saying that The vision and mission of the World Bank of fighting poverty with passion and professionalism is something I totally share. I believe that this is an enduring mission that the World Bank should hold. The question is how? How do you do it? And that's where you come to what my vision and my strategy and my mission is. To me, fighting poverty, we have to look at what confronts us in the world today. And what do we see? We see a singular problem that confronts low-income countries, emerging markets, and developed countries. That's the problem of job creation. Wherever you look, the issue is about jobs. From the European Union, where the unemployment rate is 10.8% today, an unprecedented high, to Spain, where it's over 20%, to the US here, where it's at an all-time high also of over 8%, to my own country, where it's 23% and 35% for youths, by the way, to India, where it's 9.9%. Across the globe, policymakers are grappling with one problem, and that's the problem of job creation. Why do I think this matters? I've yet to meet a single poor person who did not want the dignity of a job. People who are poor want jobs. If they don't have it for themselves, they want it for their family, for their children, for their wives. With this, they can feed themselves. They can take care of their education needs and their health needs. And that's why I think we have to focus on this. And the key issue here is youth unemployment and underemployment. While I talk of these figures, in many countries, this is a huge problem. It's even larger. The figures are sometimes ranging from more than 30% to 50% in certain countries. If we do not make use of our youth in giving them productive endeavor, productive employment, we are not only missing out on a huge demographic dividend, we are also laying the ground for more problems. We have seen what happened in the Arab Spring. It was about dignity, loss of dignity because of a lack of good jobs. It was about governance and openness. But it was about our young people not feeling valued. We must have a World Bank that focuses on this central issue of all time. And how does it do it? It has to take those problems that confront job creation and tackle them one by one. And they may vary from country to country. There's no cookie cutter and no one size fits all. But there are few problems that are common to emerging markets, middle-income countries, low-income countries. We look across and we see the problem of infrastructure in these countries. India says it needs $1 trillion over the next 5 years for infrastructure if it's to be able to create the 8 to 10 million jobs that it will need to create. China, in spite of its huge investments in infrastructure already, still needs more. Africa as a whole needs between $96 to $120 billion per year for the next few years to tackle infrastructure. In my own country, we need $10 billion a year to do this. So this is a big problem that if we could tackle the power, the light, the sanitation, water problems, we will be able to help small and medium enterprises to do better. We'll create the platform for the private sector to create jobs because that's what we need. So this is one issue. It's not good enough. You know, we talk about public-private partnerships in order to generate the resources needed. But do you know that in the past decade in Africa, only 17% of PPPs have been closed? 17% in a decade. And each one has taken an average of 7 years. This is not good enough. We need a World Bank group that can move swiftly to change the equation on this particular issue. We also need a World Bank group that deals with social issues. Education, health. When you talk about education, one of my frustrations is why we haven't done enough to bring skills to bear on our youth. It's not just about getting the education, it's about employable skills. And we have countries that know how to do this. Korea has been successful at it. Germany, Switzerland, Holland. We can bring this information, and this is something I think the World Bank has to do. to be able to skill our young people so that they're employable in the marketplace. When it comes to health, I believe we need to focus on health systems. We have vertical institutions that can deal with diseases. But let me tell you that non-communicable diseases are becoming more and more common in developing countries. And you can only tackle these with strong health systems. You have to build institutions that can work across boundaries. And I also think we need to look at issues to deal with fragile states. I think the World Bank has the skills as a preeminent institution that can mobilize all its arms to help fragile and conflict-affected states. It has to work in partnership with others because the World Bank does not know it all either. There are NGOs that have that skill. The United Nations has some of those skills. And other multilaterals. But the World Bank can be an institution that can convene and mobilize and catalyze better help to fragile and conflict-affected states. I feel very passionate about that. Why? Because many people do not know that with Paul Collier, I was the person that wrote the groundbreaking work that really set the bank's first strategy on these states. It was called LICUS then, Low-Income Countries Under Stress, something that people thought was some kind of disease. But we set that going, and it was on this basis that the World Bank's present strategy is built. Gender. I'm frustrated because I think we could do so much more on the issue of gender. We talk about it, and the World Bank has done some groundbreaking work on what it means to truly empower women and girls. But how do we actualize this? We have to speak with the countries. There's still tremendous skepticism on the ground on how to deliver. And I believe that the World Bank is well placed to work with countries. In my country, we're experimenting with something to try and make this real. The Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Women's Affairs have signed an MOU to truly mainstream gender within the agricultural sector, where we're doing a number of amazing things, to truly deliver for women and girls in that sector. And if we can make this MOU, which is specific on how in the change in the agriculture, women should be involved in the value chain, girls can be involved, making it real. We can spread it to MOUs in other sectors. This is the kind of work that the World Bank needs to harness. So we stop talking about gender, but actually do something about it. And how would I look on the other issues of working within the bank to deliver on the bank's mission? I think that there are certain instruments that we can work with. I think that we have to get the World Bank to work more on institutions. It is not a sexy thing to do. It takes time. Often the results are not as forthcoming. And by the way, the other thing I would work on is results. Everything that we do must end with measurable results. But the World Bank has to take up where other institutions may not be as strong, to build institutions, because this is at the crux of the governance and corruption issue. When countries have strong institutions, when they have systems and processes that work, corruption is much lower. At least where you find it, you will deal with it. It will not be with impunity. The World Bank needs to be a steady hand in the years to come to build institutions in countries. I also see a bank that is working on different instruments, the South-South Knowledge Exchange. I'm proud that I started this at the World Bank. What are we trying to do? More and more now, you find that investment and trade in developing countries is getting larger with other developing countries rather than with developed. Now, I'm not saying that North-South is not important, but I believe that we can take this instrument and intermediate knowledge, finance, investments, much more south to south. By the way, I also think there's room to intermediate knowledge south to north. Because like I said before, if you look at Greece today and the problems and challenges it's facing, look at what is happening. structural reforms that were not done. The World Bank can help with that, and it can learn from what successes southern countries have had in this. Taking care of safety nets, pension systems. Brazil has done tremendous work on safety nets that can be looked at. China has created jobs. I can name so many other countries that have done reforms, structural reforms, that have put their countries on par. So South-North is also something that the World Bank can intermediate and look at. And these are some of the things that I would push as new ways of doing business as we go forward. We need to build a bank for the 21st century. That bank must harness knowledge. That bank must be fast in delivering the knowledge. Middle-income countries are no longer prepared to wait, or low-income countries for that matter, when they need a question answered. 3 weeks ago, I needed some help on a particular issue in the petroleum sector. And it took some time. We eventually got the resources together. But we need to be faster in moving these institutions like the World Bank, to deliver quickly. They need a Rolodex of experts that they can call on very fast. And they need some of that expertise within the bank itself. I would work for that. I would push the bank to be a leader in terms of global governance. The voice reform that was started to give developing countries and emerging markets more voice was a difficult one, and it's not complete. It needs the collaboration of everyone, of the traditional donor partners on the board, as well as the emerging market countries, as well as the low-income countries. They all have to come together to recognize that the global environment is changing, and the bank's governance, indeed global governance, has to change with this. And I would be a catalyst for doing this. Many of the things that I've talked about here are things that need partnership. And we have to build strong partnerships. This institution is capable. A partnership with the board, a partnership with the governors, a partnership with civil society, a partnership with the beneficiaries in developing countries. The bank is a convener, and I strongly believe that it can use its strengths to build more of this partnership. I'm happy to be part of a situation in which we are looking at an institution that can also look at global public goods. This is a place where the bank has a strong comparative advantage. And as president, I would push for the bank to do more on issues of climate change, on the green growth agenda, on even diseases across borders. Many middle-income countries are looking for help on the issue of dealing with climate change. We would focus on how to help them do it, how to help low-income countries adapt. So this is an institution that can deliver on that. So I was just sharing with you a few of my thoughts on partnerships, on responsiveness of the institution, on cutting away bureaucracy so that we can respond faster to our clients, on intermediating knowledge, above all, on creating jobs for the dignity of poor people and improving their living standards. Finally, I'd like to say that the process that has begun to choose a World Bank president on a merit-based approach is a good one. And I want to thank the board of the World Bank, its governors, as well as all the G20 who have supported this and have actually made a statement saying that they support an open merit-based system. It's not really about a Nigerian, a Thai, a Sri Lankan, a Czech, a Canadian, American. That's not what it's about. All these nationalities should be free to vie to lead the World Bank. An American should be able to lead the bank. So should a Lithuanian. So should a Rwandan. That's not the issue. The issue is who brings the best skills to bear in leading this institution. When I was talking to shareholders, I never asked them to support me. No. I said support an open, merit-based process as the shareholders have outlined. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Okay.
Everybody's mics working?
Yes.
1, 2, and okay.
I'm good.
I guess we're unmuted.
Good.
Well, thank you so much for those remarks. It was a lot of certainly food for thought, and thanks to everybody for coming. We'll get to your questions in a couple of minutes here. I wanted to open up, if I could, just sort of taking off of some of your remarks here just now, and see if we could ask you to refine your vision for the bank a little bit along the following lines. You mentioned that the bank should move in to places where it has its strengths. And I'm wondering if you could be a little more precise about where you think that comparative advantage might be. And flip side of that, are there things the bank is doing right now that you feel should be scaled back in deference to other international organizations, private sector, civil society, whomever, that might be able to do it more effectively?
Well, thank you very much. I mentioned a couple of areas, or I do think that my vision about job creation, the bank has a number of strengths that can really deliver on this specific vision, and that wraps around all the challenges that I've spoken about. Why is that? I believe that the World Bank has several other institutions. It's actually a World Bank group. It has the IFC, it has MEGA, it has the bank itself. And I think that working together, they can help to leverage outside resources. When I say comparative advantage, I think that when you put all these tools and you can use guarantees and you can use other types of instruments that the World Bank can come up with, they can really leverage outside resources. Look at Africa, for instance. There is a pool of resources there in terms of pension funds within South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, just to name 3 countries. South Africa has more than 60 billion. Nigeria is accumulating at the rate of a couple of billion a year, having moved from defined benefits to defined contribution system. Kenya has a pool. And yet, you have mentioned the numbers, and it's vast. The World Bank Group has the ability to help mitigate the risks that people see in using these resources and to leverage it, because it has these through political risk, mitigating other types of. So that's one specific area, an example where I think it has a lot of strengths. On knowledge, I talked about intermediation of knowledge outside. I feel very strongly that this is a comparative advantage because one of the strongest assets of the World Bank Group is the staff. Has some of the best staff, if I may say so, that you can find aggregated. I'm not saying they're perfect, but there's so much knowledge embodied in this staff that can be used, and they can use it to trigger collaboration and knowledge elsewhere, which they can then get from one country to the other. So this is a definite strength. On global public goods, I also think that the World Bank has a comparative advantage in being able to assemble knowledge that can help country. Packaging, finance, knowledge, and capacity building as a bundle that can help countries is really something that the bank is able to do. Now, having said that, you asked me about, what you're asking is selectivity. And really, should the bank be doing everything? I think that there's room for the bank to be more selective, but maybe not in the way you're thinking, because many people see it as a full-service bank. Especially the poorer countries on IDA. And one of the things that I want to say now that I neglected to say is about IDA. The soft credit arm of the bank, where I was chair of the replenishment, the last one, and we raised $49.3 billion against all odds. I think that that countries, the poorer countries that have access to IDA, about 73 of them, see the bank as a full service institution. Maybe we have to continue to be that for these countries, but we have to be more creative about IDA going forward. I'll come back to that. But for the middle income countries, maybe we can look at the 2 or 3 areas where the bank is very strong. You know, and the bank, I would say, on the global public goods agenda, on greening growth, and leveraging infrastructure. And the bank could concentrate. If I were president, I would look at this, these areas and say, okay, can we put more of our emphasis on that? And why can't ADB, the Asian Development Bank, work on some of the other areas, or even work in partnership so that the World Bank can draw back a bit? Or the African Development Bank take more care of the full service whilst the bank focuses. So I think there are ways to partner and make the bank a bit more selective. But it's not saying bank will only do 2 things. I don't think it's as simple as that.
Okay. Let me ask you on the jobs front, since this is an issue, as you rightly point out, that's not just a concern in low or middle income countries anymore. It's fundamental to the discussion that's going on in Europe. It's fundamental to the debate in this country as well. Where do you think an institution like the bank gets its most bang for the buck when it comes to pure job creation? And I'm thinking there, do you feel it's within programs like the IFC, where you're actually financing private sector projects? Is it within infrastructure development to open up capacity? Is it within some of the social services you talk about, making sure you've got a healthy, educated population? If you had to focus just on the job creation part of it, where's your best payoff?
3 points, 3 areas. The first is on working with countries to actually develop the policies and programs that will make for a conducive environment, particularly for small and medium enterprises. They're the ones that create the most jobs. So we have to look at what policies may be inhibiting them, what obstacles. And I think that the World Bank is well placed to do that and should focus and deliver on that. You have this Doing Business report, which looks at some of the obstacles and areas where countries may need to work. And we can look at some of that, but also at other things. So that's one area I feel. The second is on targeted interventions. Sometimes, whilst you're working long-term on inclusive growth and on long-term job creation, you also need instruments that are short-term to target areas that are falling behind. And actually, you have an example that we're living now in my own country, in the northeast of Nigeria, where we're going for public works programs, and vocational training to give poor people, sometimes they need a leg up to even take advantage of the market. And so the World Bank can help with this. It has done. It does it well with these public works programs, with temporary job creation and with safety nets that can help pushing people and give them a leg up. And so I think that that's very important. And the third area that I mentioned is that I do think the bank can, work on this infrastructure problem. I wouldn't accept that we have to have 17% of deals closed in a decade. The bank as an institution working in partnership with others must be able to help countries do better than that. So those are the 3 areas I feel it has comparative advantage.
Okay, I don't want to hog the time here because I know there are lots of questions that have come in online and elsewhere, but I do want to ask one thing though.
Yes.
Take us inside the room today at the board meeting.
I don't know if I'm allowed to do that.
No. Give us a flavor of the discussion and
okay, I don't know if it's legitimate, but I can tell you that I got some of the most thoughtful questions that you could ever think about. And it made me happy because it feels that I feel like the board members are really thinking of what issues confront the bank. How do we take this bank into a 21st century? What is it that they themselves, as board members, can do? Because, it's not just the president that has to deliver. The president has to be a leader, to have the vision and the courage. It requires a lot of courage. The bank has been around 60 years. There's quite a bit of inertia. as sets in any institution, even though you have marvelous staff. So you have to have the courage to say, look, certain things that we've always done this way, they have to go. But with the board, and they could see there's a role for themselves. So they asked thoughtful questions on the vision issue, on the processes issue. They also asked me, well, you've been managing director, so why do you want to come back and what would you do differently? And I shared with them, I have a list of 11 frustrations, which I've not shared with you. You know that when I was in the bank, I kept writing them down. These are the things that frustrate me. And when I inadvertently mentioned that, they wanted to hear the 11 frustrations. So I shared it with them. Here's the list. I used to walk around with a notebook in the bank and I would jot down. There are things that really frustrate me. For instance, statistics. Many countries don't even have many developing countries have not built a solid statistical base. And we can't really do good development. We can't do conditional cash transfers without a solid database on who the poor are. The bank should focus on this and be able to deliver it. And I get frustrated when people talk about, you have to do conditional cash transfers when we don't have the database. IDA. It's a marvelous instrument of the World Bank. But we know that we cannot continue the same way. I used to say I'm not going to be around for either 21 and 23 and 30. We must think of a way because donors, their resources are getting restricted and they're getting tired. We need to be very creative about what IDA will be in future. So it's a bit of a frustration. Regional integration. If we don't help African countries to deal with, we don't have instruments. It's been 20, 30 years now. We haven't come up with instruments to deal with regional integration. Why? Is that beyond what we can think of as a group? Mortgage finance, the housing market, construction, a job creator, solver of social problems, builder of asset base for the poor. The World Bank there's a big gap there. We've not done enough. We always have all these excuses about land rights and this and that. Surely we can solve that. That's about 4 or 5 off my list of 11.
Very interesting. See, aren't you glad I asked that?
Yeah.
Nancy, before we go to the audience, anything you'd like to throw on the table here?
Sure. A couple of questions, maybe following up on some of the things you said that I like very much, Ngozi. On the issue of global public goods, climate, agricultural productivity, do you believe the bank needs more capital in order to address those issues than it has now? Do you believe it needs a different instrument than the country-based loan? Or is the implication of what you said essentially that using the current mandate and the current instruments, there's still so much more to be done? Let me raise one other question that sort of starts from the money. You just referred to the future of IDA.
I found it.
I borrowed this pen from Howard, so should IDA continue to be, should it get smaller? In the IDB now, the equivalent fund is much smaller as countries exited and became able to borrow from the hard window. Or do you think that it should be turned partly into an instrument to to subsidize lending from the IBRD, the hard window, for middle-income countries that still have many poor people? Or should its resources be directed to dealing with global public goods? I mean, there's a lot of trade-offs, obviously, but maybe you could say something about those two issues that have to do with money and mandate.
Okay. On the issues of climate change and whether the bank needs more capital to do this, I do believe the bank needs more capital, and so does IFC. I believe that if we do not get more capital for these two institutions going forward, that they'll become less and less relevant in terms of their ability to mobilize. But the issue is when.
For the IBRD and the IFC?
IFC,
yeah,
I'm
IFC,
saying they both
right.
need.
Which was not recapitalized in the latest round.
not to the extent that it needed to be. So I believe they need, but the issue is when. Let's also remember that the countries, shareholders, are going through, many of them, an extremely difficult time. And it was not easy to get this last capital increase. So I think we have to wait. If you go now, the appetite is not there. I think we have to wait until these countries are better in terms of recovery, until their fiscal situation is better. You know, that could be 5 years from now. But it certainly cannot be 20 years from now. It took 20 years for a new capital increase. If we wait 20 years, we've lost the momentum to help use this institution. So I believe we should give it time. You know, we should watch it to see how strong these institutions and the appetite that their parliaments may have to bring this in. But inevitably, I think we have to do this. There are also other things to look at. We could look at pricing issues, for instance. You know, we practice quite a bit of price differentiation in IDA, from grants all the way to hardened terms. But in IBRD, the discussion on pricing is a very difficult one. You know, because the emerging market countries are a little, find this a little tough to deal with. But for me, in order for the bank to be effective on issues of climate change, on infrastructure and others, we need to put all options on the table about how this institution can do more. And I believe that those are some of the areas we need to look.
Excuse me, let me, just on this, what about more capital from the emerging markets?
I would strongly, I think there are some emerging markets whom, given the room, the opportunity, would want to do more. But Nancy, this is a collaborative, where if an emerging market country comes in with more, their shareholding increases, and that means by force that the shareholding of someone else decreases. And you must, but we know we must husband all people, all shareholders in this institution. We don't want to upset certain shareholders. We need to have that conversation to get people to know and agree that they have to pull back for the good of the bank, so that those who have more resources to put in capital can do so. On the issue of either smaller or larger supporting mix or dealing with global public goods. You know, IDA has been a wonderful instrument that has really served and helped poor countries for quite some time. So I'm not sure the issue is larger or smaller. The issue is, what is the mission that is left for IDA to do? And how best can it accomplish it? I see the IDA person and the World Bank, Axel van Trotzenberg, looking at me. So if I say the wrong things, you can correct me. But I think that, you know, we must husband this instrument and still make it work for the poorer countries. I think IDA's mission should still be focusing on the poorer countries in the group. And if it has to transit some better off countries, it can do that, but it should do it sensitively. Because remember that 70% of the world's poor still live in middle-income countries. And they're very sensitive about this. So we cannot just overnight, abruptly, just move some of them without a proper transition mechanism. But I think the issue about IDA is, what type of IDA? How do we conceive of something really interesting and different? Can some of the resources of IDA be used in a way that, you know, is an IDA bank that can leverage additional resources from outside and work even better for these countries? Those are some of the questions that I would ask and think about.
Okay. Well, why don't we, if we could, open it up to any audience members here. I think we've got a roving mic on a couple sides here. And I would ask, please give us a name and affiliation so we know who we're talking to, if we could. And I will start over, anybody up there? Okay, we'll get to the press in a second, but let's have somebody, right, gentleman right here. Right, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Tom Tsui, I'm former bank staff, and I want to thank Nancy and CGD for being something my country does, which is arranged marriages and trying to bring Ngozi with the party, and I hope it works out. My question is, touches on some of the things that Ngozi and Nancy talked about. One is, the World Bank has been a global financial institution, but I hear a lot about the World Bank being a knowledge bank, and that sounds really good. But if you only lend $57 billion, say 2 years ago, and Nancy is coming up with, bigger bucks, but that's fine. But Ngozi, what do you see as the future of the balance between a financial transfer development institution, a knowledge bank, and if it is one or the other, how is that going to help the sub-Saharan African girls who really have no economic empowerment? What would you do to help that? Sorry, I'm segueing into the topic I'm really interested in.
How would I help sub-Saharan?
The sub-Saharan women in terms of getting access to economic empowerment, jobs, and economic opportunities. I hear that in Ethiopia, if you can harness the women in employment, they would improve the GDP by 2 to 2.5% a year, which is amazing. Thank you.
I think that the way the world is evolving now, it cannot be either or for the World Bank. It cannot just be a financial bank or a knowledge bank. It certainly has to be the two. And I think the strength of the bank has been over time, it's not really new, how it bundles knowledge and finances together. And even technical assistance, if you want to call it that, I prefer to call it capacity building to help countries deliver on their objectives. So I see the bank doing all three. I certainly do not believe that the bank can be just a knowledge bank. I think countries are still looking to the bank to bring financial resources to the table. And that's why we're saying that given the capital base we have now, we have to think of more creative ways for the bank to leverage those financial resources outside using its instruments. But on knowledge, more and more middle-income countries, even low-income countries, are looking to the bank for ideas and knowledge on how to solve difficult problems. And I believe that on that, the bank has to be faster and quicker. When it is asked, for instance, on how do I put together a PPP, it has to be able to assemble a World Bank group team that can come and deliver and work with the country, not come for 1 day or two, but stay whatever time is needed. Or have those people close by so they can be mobilized.
This is your Rolodex of experts.
This is my role. And because you cannot have all those people within the bank because the resources are not there, you must have this Rolodex that you can call on of people who have done it elsewhere. One time I needed somebody on tax policy. And the bank couldn't, this was my first time as finance minister. And they told me, it would take another 3 weeks to get the team. Well, I called the IMF sent a team. And the IMF brought an Australian that had done this for 25 years. And it was enormously helpful. I think that Australian singular person on that team was more value to me. So it's that kind of bundling. The bank can also work with the IMF and other institutions to partner on doing that. So I really do believe it's both. I believe if we don't get smart about doing it with the bank, increasingly they'll turn to other knowledge institutions. They can be think tanks, can be McKinsey. Sometimes I've called McKinsey to help. I've called think tank or two in Nigeria to come and help to deliver these things. Now, in terms of the how would you help in sub-Saharan Africa for girls and women? I think, look, the knowledge work on girls and women has been done. There's no question anymore on the economics of empowering girls and women. So the question before us is, using this powerful work that has recently been done by how do we make it real within World Bank and on the ground in governments? There's still a lot of skepticism. It's not in every country that people believe that girls and women are, empowering them is going to generate all those benefits in a way. So you've got to work with them very closely to bring this knowledge. But I mentioned to you the example of an MOU between our Minister of Agriculture and Ministry of Women's Affairs. That's a very practical approach. When I was saying to the Minister of Women's Affairs herself, believes that she should get all these resources and was quite disappointed in the budget. We doubled our budget, but from a very low base. And I said to her, what you don't need is a huge pile of money, because even with that, you cannot deliver. We need to work with minister after minister to get them. If we are transforming agriculture,
How in the value chain approach are we going to ensure that girls and women get those jobs? If we are going to be transforming and processing agricultural products in the country, how do we do that? How do we make sure? Those are the practical day-to-day issues that I would have to say the bank has to sit and hammer home. And you don't have to do it everywhere at once. Let's start with one or two sectors in one or two countries, and then we have experience and we extend it. That's the way that I would go about things.
Okay, let's see. Danny here, my
Maybe
friend
we should take 2 or 3 questions.
You want to do that a couple at a
Right.
time?
Yeah, because
Yeah,
it do.
okay. All right, let's do. Let me take a cluster then from the press section here. Let's go Danny and Leslie, and you just I'll ask you questions real quick, and she'll respond in a group because we are running short.
Thank you, Howard. Danny Shifengjiang with China's Xinhua News Agency. Now, 2 years ago, World Bank President Robert Zoellick proposed modernizing multilateralism in a multipolar world. And in your perspective, what needs to be done to fulfill this goal? Secondly, are you satisfied with the process by far to select a World Bank new chief? Should like open debate be added into the process? Should the executive board to select a chief by votes, not by consensus? What's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Okay, Leslie, you want to quickly?
Thank you. Leslie Rawton from Reuters. The United States says that one of its reasons why it should continue to lead the bank is so that it can guarantee that funds keep flowing from Congress. How would you, or how do you think that a non-American can convince Congress to keep those funds flowing and keep it interested in funding the bank? And given that, if the largest shareholder, like the United States, says to you, you're the head of the bank, says to you, we can't lend to Iran or Egypt, how do you deal with that?
Okay, and one more from our press friends here.
Thanks so much. Lisa Friedman from Climate Wire. Appreciate doing this today. Energy development has been one of the biggest fights at the bank over the past few years, specifically the bank's decision to fund some very controversial coal plants in India and South Africa, now Kosovo, as at the same time as it's trying to take a larger role in addressing climate change. Right now, there is an energy strategy that has been stuck that calls for an end to coal loans to middle-income countries, stuck by the objections of China and Brazil and other countries that are concerned that the bank is addressing climate change perhaps on the backs of developing countries. So my question, Minister, is do you believe that coal loans should be ended either for middle-income countries as the energy strategy proposes or
coal loans?
Coal, for coal plants. If not, could you explain why not? And if so, could you explain what you would do as president to dislodge this dynamic? Thanks.
Can I just add to the first set of questions on process? What would you think, were you the president of the World Bank, about the idea of introducing the double majority voting for the head of the bank in of the type that's used at some of the regional banks, where a majority of countries, as well as a majority of weighted votes, would be needed in the future to elect someone, which would protect both the US, it would protect the Europeans, but would also give some power to coalitions of developing countries. Too many questions, so I think we should let,
a lot of balls in the air
her choose.
Okay. The issue about what is modernization mean in a multipolar world, or the words of Zoellick. I think that these words are real and recognize what is happening within the world. And that's why we must modernize global governance, because it is now a truism that developing countries, emerging market countries, are contributing more than 50% to global growth. If this is happening, we no longer have a bipolar or unipolar world, but we have multiple poles of growth. Even look at Africa. Africa is growing at more than 5%, projected to grow at more than 6%. It's rebounded fast from the crisis. Usually, it has a lag of about a year, but it's come back very fast and it's contributing its quota. So we can no longer look at, just the developed countries as sources of growth, but we have to look at different poles. I think this is real. And that is why you also cannot look at global governance in the same old way that you used to, but must recognize this changing constellation of powers. The fact that China is the second largest economy in the world and is positioned to be the largest, even if on per capita income basis, it's still not one of the top, has to be taken account of because of the weight. And so this is what is meant, and I subscribe to that. I do not believe that if you ignore this reality, you can really have global governance that works, because these countries will not feel valued within the global system. Now, on the issue of the process of selection, I really want to commend the shareholders of the World Bank and the G20 for having put on paper their desire, their pledge to have an open, transparent, and merit-based system. That was recognizing that the world is changing and that these institutions deserve the best. I already addressed it by saying, why shouldn't an American lead the World Bank? They should, if they're the best. Why shouldn't a Sri Lankan or a Chinese? And I think that the process for doing this should be clearly spelled out. I'm proud to say that in Africa, people do not know we're leading the way in this kind of selection. This process of selecting the head of the African Development Bank, believe it or not, was open, merit-based, and everything this institution is still struggling to do. I chaired the last selection of the head of the African Development Bank. And believe me, coming in, many of the candidates that countries said they were supporting and who thought they would win didn't. Because we, the governors, meaning the finance ministers, had I think it was 5 shortlisted candidates, were asked at the annual meetings, which was then held in Abuja and I chaired, to come and each make a presentation and answer questions from the governors. And they did. One by one, they made a statement, governors asked them questions, they went through the whole process. And do you know what? At the end of the process, the best person won. And it was not the person that some people had expected to get it coming in, because that person had so many support of donor countries and other shareholders. But it was an open, merit-based process. So we're leading the way in Africa in doing this. And I would invite the developed countries to take a look at this issue. Now, how would a non-American persuade Congress? I think this is I think Leslie asked that question. It's a very important issue. Now, many people keep worrying about this. You know that America will drop this institution if it has a leader that is selected based on merit. I think when this compact was signed, the US was part of it. They signed on to it. We value the US tremendously. US is the biggest donor to IDA, along with the UK. But they were there. They signed on to this process. And these are the values that Americans cherish. They cherish competition. They cherish merit. They cherish the best. And I don't know why they would not cherish it at an institution of global significance sitting in their capital. So I am not pessimistic. I really think that we should need to turn this question around. And we need to say to the American people that your government has done something unprecedented. America has been a leader in so many places and so many things. The world is asking the US to lead on this. Because if the US does not lead by staying true to its values of transparency, openness, and merit, others will not lead. So I think this is to the benefit of the US. It can claim victory all the way. And this is what we will say to the US Congress, that really this process is one that has shown the US at its best. And they ought to applaud it. And then we will mobilize the shareholders, the other shareholders, to go and talk to the US Congress and say to them that you've really done something good. And therefore you deserve to keep supporting this. We will also use some professional help to do it. I would make it my job to use my persuasive powers to go there. I remember that when we were doing the debt deal, we went on Congress. You know, everybody said it can never be done. Nigeria is an oil-based country. Oil prices are high. It will never happen. We went on the Hill, and there was a certain Senator Barack Obama who was among those who were skeptical. In the end, we were able to, our legislators were able to convince that this is something they ought to support. So we have tools and means. I don't have to spell every single one out, but I'm not at all pessimistic. I think we are misjudging the US Congress.
I think we'll tell them to batten down the hatches.
Yeah.
Up there.
On energy development, this is a very difficult issue, of course, and one that has to be dealt with a lot of tact and balance. Now, we have to look at this issue, again, in a collaborative way. We have to think that there are certain countries, I mean, the policy now that either countries, for instance, at least the lower income countries, that the bank will continue to support the development of coal in these countries using the best technologies available. And I believe they are there, is a sensible one, because some of these may not have any alternatives. You know, if you're a landlocked country with very few resources and coal is the only energy source you have, what do you do? And I don't think the World Bank should shy away. Even middle-income countries, I think when I listen to them, be they in Eastern Europe where Poland is focusing on moving away to clean energy alternatives and green growth, they too are desirous. I don't think these countries are saying we want to pollute the world. I think the World Bank should be helping them to find affordable alternatives. And where this is not possible, then using the best technology to try and use this coal. After all, the developed countries, still much of their energy is fired from coal. And they're doing it using the best technologies to make this, you know, so we need to approach this from a commonsensical and sensible standpoint. You know, let's get these countries to focus on climate change and green growth, but let's see where they do not have good alternatives that will work with them on the best technologies.
Now, I want to move to a couple of online questions here, if I could, real quick, as people have written in really from around the world, I think. I didn't know some of the names, but I did a little research. And it looks like we got some questions from all around the globe. And one leapt out to me here. It was from Elizabeth Stewart at Oxfam. She says, do you think country ownership and results are mutually exclusive? And if not, can you explain in what way you deal with the trade-offs to facilitate both? I think that speaks to both an overall governance issue, but also to the frustration you expect with you express with speed. You know, to a certain extent, you know, getting buy-in may take more time, or not. I don't know. But that's the you know, the issue there. What's the tension between making sure everything's you know, well accepted and set up locally, and doing what may be, you know, from an economic perspective, optimally best?
I'm a little surprised at this question because I do not believe you can get results without country ownership. So I don't see it, and maybe I'm not getting it, but this question presumes that World Bank staff have to come and work at country ownership. And then that takes time, like you said, and therefore, you know, you don't get results on time. I don't see it that way. I actually see that the bank has been changing. The bank that I met in 1982 when I joined as a young professional is not the bank of today. And the bank needs to sell this more aggressively for people to understand. Because out there, people still have a perception of the bank as this neoliberal, they love to say neoliberal in my country, institution that is doing things to people. No, the bank is really changing. And there's more and more listening to countries and allowing countries to set the agenda. And I think this is what country ownership is. And bank staff must indeed be patient to allow countries to set this agenda. Now, I say to countries, fellow finance ministers, when we're talking, other leaders, if you don't set the agenda, don't blame bank staff if they step into the breach and set your agenda for you. You must take ownership. You must take responsibility for crafting the strategies of your country and what you want to use the World Bank for. Some countries are marvelous at doing this. I remember when I was country director for Malaysia, during the East Asian financial crisis and before, the Malaysians knew what they wanted. They knew exactly where the bank would fit into their development approach and strategy and how to use it. So I think that that's the way to go, and that if you do that, you are more likely to get results. When in Nigeria, during my first time, we were able to write our own development medium-term strategy called NEEDS, Nigerian Economic Empowerment and Development, which set out our vision. Then we invited the bank to come and the fund to support us, and we delivered results based on that.
Okay, back to the audience here, if we could. Here in the, yes, ma'am, if you would.
Thank you. Jo Marie Griesgraber, New Rules for Global Finance. When you mentioned the word taxes, I thought immediately of the illicit financial flows issue and the amount of money escaping from developing countries, not principally through corruption or gangs of drug lords, but rather through the use of mispricing through transfer pricing, the transfer mispricing phenomenon where corporations don't pay their fair share. Does the World Bank have a role in addressing that issue as countries lose substantial amounts of money?
And let's take one more, if we could, right up here, just so we can get through a couple.
Thank you very much. And I think you, Minister, spoke very elegantly on the issue of...
Identify yourself, please.
Yeah, Jendai Fraser, sorry.
Sorry.
I think you spoke very well on the issue of the Congress. And I agree with you that we would be misjudging the Congress to think that it would deny funding to the World Bank, given the important role that it plays in the world, if the leadership didn't come from America. That said, it's the U.S. administration that actually puts forward a candidate and directs that candidate to try to put them into that position. My question is the Europeans. You've given a great answer to us on the Americans, but what are you saying to the European countries? In many ways, they collude together, the U.S. and America, to maintain control over the IMF and the World Bank. And so I think you need to deal with both, not just America.
Just to identify, Jendai Usmanis, former Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, as I'm sure Ngozi knows, in the Bush administration. Thanks, Jendai.
Okay.
Please.
The question of taxes and illicit financial flows and misprice is a very important one. I think that, when I think about who should be dealing with this, I think the IMF should also be brought into the picture on this one, and may have more of a comparative advantage in dealing with this than the World Bank. But nevertheless, I think that at the beginning, the front end, the downstream part, or is it upstream part of this issue, where countries are entering into some agreements. I just have one in mind. Take my country and the joint venture agreements entered into with oil companies. That's the front end. If the World Bank certainly has some comparative advantage in either assisting or bringing in knowledge that can help countries to craft these agreements in a manner that is much more beneficial to themselves. We have this joint venture agreement. I'm not sure who was across the table, whether we really had the requisite lawyers with the expertise. But when you look at some of them, you're also a little bit astonished, because not only we have 57%, the oil companies have the balance, but they're also the managers. And they, as the managers of the joint venture, they come to you and tell you how much they need in terms of costs. So they come and tell us, well, it's going to cost us 15 billion this year, and your share is, 8 billion or whatever it is. And we have no way, there's complete asymmetry of information on this issue. I think that if we had had the kind of help upstream to deal with this, we would have been in better position to reap more benefits. So that's where I think the World Bank can come in. Now, the IMF should come in looking overall at these kinds of flows and how we can deal with these issues. And I think they have a strong comparative advantage for doing that. So both of them together, I think, would be the right way to go. Now, the U.S. administration and the Europeans, yes, I want to agree with Jendai that, it's not just the U.S. administration that has to be looked at. I was specifically asked about the U.S., but Europeans and U.S. bear responsibility on this issue. And I think why there's a bit of a problem now is because of the process that took place for the IMF, where you have one of the most wonderful leaders running the institution. And I don't think she really needed any block to talk for her. Has she been allowed to compete? I'm very confident that she would have had the ability to do well, because she has all what it takes. And I'm a strong believer in Christine Lagarde. Now, the two sets have to come together. Somebody has to break this. The US cannot say because the Europeans did that, so we have to do it. Then next time the Europeans will say, well, the US did that, so we'll do that. Do you see what I'm saying? That's what I'm saying, that this could continue. And therefore, who is a leader in this world? The US is looked on for leadership. And it's very clear to me that if the US does not see this in the best of lights, just imagine what would happen in the world if the US took the lead and said, look, we're really going to do this on merit. And therefore, the next time the Europeans, the world would be electrified. It doesn't have to be that it's Okonjo-Iweala. Let the best person win. That's the point I'm trying to make. So both of them bear joint responsibility not to continue a system that is 60 years out of date. I don't mind who wins. I have tremendous respect for the other two participants in this process. I respect Dr. Jim Kim. I think I'm grateful to him for what he's done for the developing countries in his area. And if he's the best person, let him win. The same with Professor Campo. When I went around, I never asked anybody, I didn't go around that much anyway, but one or two places, I did not ask anyone to support me. I didn't. I said support an open, fair, and transparent process, because I believe the US should run this institution if they have the best person.
I want to be respectful of time. We are running up against our 4:30 close date. Do we have time for one more question, do you think? I don't know what your schedule is.
Yeah, one more, just one.
One more, perhaps? Okay, please, you can do the honor to close it out.
Oh, boy. Well, thank you. I wanted to ask...
Please identify.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, Mark Rentschler from the Bank Information Center. You may know that the World Bank is going to be reviewing its environmental and social policies in the next couple of years.
Is going to what?
Is going to be reviewing its environmental and social safeguard policies in the next couple of years. And civil society organizations from the South and the North welcome this because the bank has fallen behind in some areas, fallen behind international law and some other institutions. But at the same time, we're concerned because there's a fear that the bank may try to weaken its policies to attract more business. So I wonder what your objectives would be in the review of the World Bank's policies, and would you commit to strengthening those social and environmental policies to be up to international law and not to allow them to be weakened?
Well, thank you very much. I think that, the bank's, social and environmental policies and safeguards some of the strengths as well as some of the weaknesses of the bank. Why do I say that? I think when we review this, we should not necessarily think about weakening. I think we should think about how does the World Bank bring these policies up to modern day problems and standards. So I don't know whether it's, and in such a way that it can also deliver these policies to countries in a way that is fast enough. Sometimes because of, the way we go about, or the bank goes about implementing these or reviewing these or applying these policies, it takes longer to get through a process and get through a project and deliver resources on the ground. And countries are always afraid that it's going to take so long. And yet, when they see how good these policies are, they are often grateful that they've applied them because it's brought something new to their way of doing business. I think one way around this is to see whether the bank can build the country's capabilities in these safeguard areas so that you can bless them. So if a country has the desire to adopt the right social and environmental policies, not just for World Bank projects, but for the whole country, why shouldn't we do it for the whole country? Why must it only apply to World Bank operations? I would like to see these things adopted and working. So I would put more energy on trying to review those and then see if we can build the capability within the countries. If you go to South Africa, when they were doing the ESCOM project, you saw that some of the environmental standards were higher even than some of the things that were being said in the World Bank. And that was something. It was easy to say, fine, we bless this. Procurement. We need to look at country systems, not just talking about it, but really, look, if a country is spending $10 billion and the World Bank is bringing $1 billion, wouldn't you like to see the World Bank build capability so that environmental and social safeguards around the $10 billion really works? So I would push the bank in that direction. And then when they can certify that a country really is able to do this, then they should be able to use their own processes and procedures. So I wouldn't be afraid. If I were president, I value those policies. I think I would be reviewing them in a way that can be delivered, but faster. I think one of the things in the bank is we get sometimes wrapped up, and it may have to do with risk, the so-called risk aversion issues, that people feel afraid to take certain decisions. So they have to certify and recertify over and over again that something is right. And then they have to review it. And it takes 10 months and a year. And by then, the country has lost interest. And I'm sitting on the other side of the table. I see this every day. And I believe that if the bank doesn't do something about it, safeguarding those things that are good, but delivering them to the countries in a timely manner, that it will lose more and more countries. So that would be my answer to you. Do not be afraid. I think we need civil society to keep the World Bank and keep even countries on their toes, I remember just a last anecdote to round this off, that we had this thing in Nigeria, where we had the subsidy phase out. We have these subsidies. When I left government the last time, subsidies to oil, which are supposed to help the poor, were about $2 billion. I came back on August 17, 2011, and subsidies had climbed to $8 billion. And by the time we rounded out 2011, they were $13 billion. 39% more than the federal budget. 130-something% of the capital budget. And much of this was going into the hands of some dealers who were actually spiriting the oil out of the country to sell in neighboring countries and then coming back to collect subsidies. So it was actually going into the hands of fraudulent people. Our central bank governor is here. So it was very clear to me that this had to be taken care of. And I'm going to come to where NGOs matter. So it had to be phased out because of its impact. And then this was done in January, and you had NGOs on the street and everybody. The joke. 6 months before I was asked by the president to come, I'd seen in the newspapers, you know, that you look online, that governors protest subsidy and they want the subsidy phased out. When the president asked me to come, I joked with my husband. I thought he would be here this afternoon. That I said, "Ike, I hope this subsidy thing is taken care of before I get there. Because I know if I arrive, whatever happens will be put squarely on my shoulders." But the point is that because more and more money was being deducted from the states, the governors were the ones fighting to have the subsidy phased out. But what happened? It wasn't done before I got there. What happened? The thing was implemented. Guess what? Exactly what I said would happen happened. That it suddenly became Okonjo-Iweala's policy and Okonjo-Iweala's problem. Do you understand what I'm saying? NGOs then came out massively protesting. And of course, there were opposition people who were ready to capitalize on this. You know, because they never wanted me to come back. So they threw all sorts of things in the internet, invented all sorts of lies against me, and then tried to stick the subsidy thing. But all the same, I think that one wonderful thing that came out of the whole thing was that for the first time, CSOs in our country came out and demanded more accountability and openness. And people are shocked when I say I actually think it's one of the best things that happened. Because we had people asking for government to be more accountable. And I think CSOs and NGOs are important for this, and I value them. They came to my office afterwards and expected that I'll be very upset. No. We spent 4 hours together, occupying Nigeria. And other NGOs came to see me. And by the time they left, they were asking if we could take pictures together. I leave the rest to you. Thank you very much.
Howard, I just want to say,
Yeah, please, Nancy.
passion. Ngozi started with passion and professionalism, and she ended with passion and professionalism.
Well, I, on the other hand, am accountable for time, so we do have to call it off here. I just want to remind everybody, first, thank you very much for extending so much of yours. Tomorrow, 4 o'clock, we'll be back here with Jose Antonio Ocampo, one of the other candidates. And just to answer the question, of course, we have extended the invitation also to Dr. Jim Kim. We are still hopeful. We don't know what's going to happen there. Have not heard definitively yet, but we'll see. But tomorrow, anyway, 4 o'clock for sure. Thank you very much.